The Galactic Alliance has a strict safety rule: never enter a high-gravity zone. For every species in the galaxy, heavy gravity is a death sentence. It snaps spines, crushes organs, and stops hearts instantly. But when Sergeant Mike arrived on the space station, he did not look for the safe zones. Instead, he asked for the most dangerous room on the ship. The alien crew watched in absolute terror as the human locked himself inside a chamber designed to crush solid metal waste. They thought he was trying to commit suicide. They prepared their medical scanners to record his death. But Mike wasn't trying to die. He was just looking for a place to work out how Earth's crushing gravity turns humans into monsters, and why the rest of the galaxy is terrified of what humans call Leg Day. Commander Zill floated down the white hallway of the Galactic Alliance Station with perfect grace. He was a tall, thin creature with limbs that looked like dry branches. To his species, the station was a paradise. The gravity was set to low, just how they liked it. It was safe, gentle, and quiet. But beside him walked a monster. Sergeant Mike was a human from the planet Earth, and he did not float gracefully. He stomped. Every time Mike took a step, his heavy boots hit the floor with a loud thud that made Zill flinch. Mike looked uncomfortable. He kept bouncing too high with every step, waving his arms to keep his balance. To the human, this station felt like being underwater, and he hated it. His muscles were twitching because they had nothing to do. Zill stopped in front of a large window that showed the stars outside. He spoke softly to the human, explaining that this was the safest place in the galaxy. He told Mike that the environmental controls were set to minimize all physical stress. There was no heavy wind, no harsh lights, and most importantly, almost no gravity to hurt their fragile bones. Zill was proud of this safety. He expected Mike to look happy, but the human just looked bored and frustrated. Mike cracked his neck with a loud popping sound that made Zill feel sick. The human complained that he felt soft. He told the commander that his body was forgetting how to be strong. They continued their tour until they reached the lower levels of the ship. This area was not for living, it was for machines and waste processing. Mike suddenly stopped. His eyes locked onto a thick, reinforced metal door. There were flashing red lights all around it. Large warning signs were painted in universal yellow, screaming, danger, and lethal gravity. Zill quickly moved to block the human's path. He explained that this was the waste compression chamber. It was a dangerous room where the artificial gravity was turned up high to crush trash into small cubes. Zill warned that entering the room while active would shatter a normal skeleton instantly. Mike walked past the terrified commander and looked through the thick glass of the chamber door. He did not look scared. A strange, hungry smile appeared on his face. He placed his hand on the control panel. Zill panicked, trying to explain that the machine inside simulated the crushing force of a death world. He told Mike that the gravity inside was set to Terra standard. Zill thought this was a warning, but Mike nodded his head. The human said that Terra standard sounded just like home. While Zill trembled with fear for his guest, Mike opened the door to the death chamber, looking forward to the pain. The heavy metal door hissed shut, sealing Mike inside the waste compression chamber. To Commander Zill, who stood safe on the other side of the reinforced glass, this looked like a tomb. The room was stark and cold, with heavy steel plates on the floor designed to withstand immense pressure. Mike stood in the center of the room, looking calm. He tapped the interface on the wall. Zill watched the digital display on the outer control panel climb rapidly. The numbers flashed red as they passed the galactic safety limit. Mike set the artificial gravity to 100% of Earth's pull. The machine groaned as the gravity generators powered up, filling the air with a deep, vibrating hum that shook the glass. Inside the chamber, the effect was instant. Zill gasped as he saw the human's body sink. Mike's shoulders dropped, and his spine compressed visibly under the invisible weight. To the frail alien commander, it looked like Mike was being crushed by a giant, invisible hand. Zill pressed his hands against the glass, his large black eyes wide with terror. He waited for the sound of snapping bones or the sight of the human collapsing into a puddle of biological fluid. The ship's computer began to shout warnings into the hallway. It detected that the biological entity inside was under lethal stress. The red light spun wildly, signaling that a living creature was about to be destroyed by the crushing force. But Mike did not collapse. Instead, he took a deep, loud breath that fogged up the glass for a second. He rolled his shoulders back and cracked his knuckles again. Then, he did something that made Zill scream in horror. The human began to jump. He threw his legs out and dropped his chest to the floor, slamming against the steel plates with violence. Then, he pushed himself up and jumped into the air, clapping his hands above his head. He did this again and again. Thud, jump, clap. Thud, jump, clap. The floor vibrated with every impact. Zill did not understand what he was seeing. He grabbed his communicator and shouted for the medical team. He believed the human was having a seizure caused by the pressure on his brain. The movements looked like violent spasms of a dying animal. Zill watched as water began to pour down Mike's face and soak his shirt. The alien thought this was plasma leaking from the skin because of the internal pressure. He could not comprehend that the human was smiling. To Zill, the warm-up looked like a desperate battle for survival against the crushing grip of gravity, and he was certain the human was losing. The medical team arrived at the observation window just as Mike stopped his violent jumping. They were small, gray creatures with large heads, carrying floating stretchers. They pressed their faces against the glass next to Commander Zill, waiting for the human to fall apart. But Mike did not fall. He walked over to the corner of the room where the heavy calibration units were stored. These were thick, solid circles of density-enhanced iron, used to test if the waste crusher was working properly. On this space station, heavy hydraulic machines were required to lift them because they were far too heavy for any biological life form to move. Zill whispered to the doctors that the human had gone mad from the pressure and was hallucinating. Mike grabbed a long, solid steel bar and placed it on a waist-high rack. Then, he did something that made the doctors drop their medical scanners in shock. He reached down and picked up one of the heavy iron plates with one hand. The muscles in his arm bunched up like hard, knotted ropes. He slid the heavy metal circle onto the bar with a loud metallic clang that rang through the room. Then he walked to the other side and grabbed another plate. Zill began to shake with fear. He realized the human was not satisfied with just the gravity crushing him. The human was actively building a torture device. Zill believed that Mike was piling heavy debris onto his shoulders to ensure he would be flattened completely under the extra weight. The weight on the bar became terrifyingly heavy. It was now enough mass to crush a small transport vehicle on Zill's home planet. Mike stood in front of the bar and stared at it angrily, breathing heavily through his nose. His skin turned a deep shade of red. The veins in his neck and arms popped out, looking like thick blue snakes trying to escape his body. The ship's medical scanner, which was reading Mike's vitals through the glass, started beeping rapidly. It showed that Mike's heart was beating at a speed that would explode a normal alien heart. His blood pressure was rising to critical levels. The aliens viewed these readings as signs of imminent death. Sweat poured off Mike's body in streams now. It dripped from his nose and chin, creating a small puddle on the steel floor. Zill watched with sadness, convinced that the human was crying in pain while his internal fluids leaked out due to the squeezing pressure. Mike wiped his hands on his shorts and gripped the rough metal of the bar tight. He let out a low, animalistic growl that vibrated through the glass window. The aliens covered their sensitive ears. They prepared themselves to watch the human snap in half, unable to understand that Mike was simply getting ready to lift. Mike stepped under the heavy iron bar and rested it across the back of his shoulders. To Commander Zill and the terrified medical team, this looked like a method of execution. The weight on the bar was immense, yet the human stood there, balancing it on his spine. Zill covered his mouth with his long, thin fingers. He was certain that the human's vertebrae were being ground into dust at that very moment. Mike gripped the bar tightly, his knuckles turning white. He took a massive breath of air and held it, puffing out his cheeks. His face turned a dark shade of purple. The aliens thought he was choking to death, suffocating under the strain of his own foolishness. Mike took 2 heavy steps back, and the reinforced floor plates groaned under the concentrated mass. Then, Mike began to descend. He bent his knees and lowered his hips. The movement was slow and controlled. The alien doctors flinched, expecting his legs to snap like dry twigs. To them, it looked like his body was finally collapsing under the unbearable gravity. Mike went lower and lower until his legs were fully bent. He paused at the bottom, hovering there with hundreds of pounds of iron crushing him down. The room was silent except for the hum of the gravity generator. Zill held his breath, waiting for the crash. He thought the human was stuck, pinned to the floor by his own hubris, unable to ever stand up again. Suddenly, a loud, guttural roar erupted from Mike's throat. It was a primal sound, full of aggression and power. He drove his feet into the floor and pushed upward. His legs shook violently as he fought against the gravity. He did not collapse, he rose. He pushed the iron back up, inch by agonizing inch. The effort was visible on every inch of his body. His neck muscles bulged, and his eyes stared straight ahead with intense focus. With one final grunt of exertion, he stood fully upright and locked his knees. He stepped forward and slammed the bar back onto the rack with a deafening crash of metal against metal. The station's artificial intelligence immediately sounded a new alarm. "Critical alert," the robotic voice announced. "Microfractures detected in skeletal structure. Extensive tearing of muscle fibers." The computer was detecting the normal damage that happens when humans build muscle, but to the aliens, it sounded like a catastrophe. Zill looked at the medical scanner in horror. The machine reported that the human had just ripped his own muscles apart from the inside. Zill could not understand why the human was not screaming in agony. Instead, Mike walked in a small circle, shaking his legs out and breathing hard. He did not look like a dying man. He looked like someone who was just getting started. Commander Zill could not take it anymore. The computer kept shouting about torn muscles and bone stress, and the human looked red and exhausted. Zill was sure that Mike was seconds away from death. With a cry of panic, Zill slammed his fist onto the large red, "Emergency Stop" button on the wall. The effect was instant and chaotic. The deep hum of the gravity generators cut out, and the lights in the room switched to a flashing orange safety mode. The artificial gravity didn't just go back to normal, the emergency system turned it off completely to save the victim inside. Inside the chamber, the world turned upside down. Mike, who had been reaching for his water bottle, suddenly floated up toward the ceiling. The heavy iron plates, which weighed hundreds of pounds just seconds ago, drifted off the rack like balloons. They bumped gently against the walls. The sweat on Mike's skin formed into little floating balls of liquid. The door to the chamber slid open with a hiss, and the medical team flew inside, using small air jets on their suits to move quickly. They swarmed around Mike like worried insects, pointing scanners at his chest and trying to strap him onto a floating stretcher. Mike looked completely confused. He gently pushed the frantic doctors away. He had to be careful, because his human strength was now unchecked by gravity. A simple push sent one of the doctors spinning across the room until he hit the wall. Mike grabbed the handle on the wall to stop himself from floating away and shouted for everyone to calm down. He was breathing hard, but he was not in pain. He looked at Zill, who was floating near the doorway, clutching a medical bag. Mike asked why they had ruined his workout. He seemed annoyed, not grateful for being saved. Zill looked at the human with wide, watery eyes. He asked Mike why he was trying to kill himself. He pointed to the computer screen that still showed the warnings about muscle damage. Zill's voice trembled as he asked what kind of sadness would make a man crush his own bones on purpose. Mike paused and wiped his face with a towel. He laughed, a deep booming sound in the small room. He explained that he wasn't trying to die, he was trying to get stronger. He told the horrified commander that the damage was necessary to build bigger muscles. Then, Mike looked at his watch and sighed. He told Zill that the squatting was just the warm-up, and because of the interruption, he hadn't even started his cardio running yet. Zill fainted, his thin body going limp as he floated in the air. Later that same cycle, the station returned to its quiet routine. Commander Zill was walking near the cargo bay, trying to calm his nerves after the events in the gym. Suddenly, a loud alarm blared through the hallway. A magnetic loader in the cargo bay had failed during a transfer. A massive supply crate, lined with thick lead-to-shield radiation, had slipped from the ceiling clamps. It crashed down and pinned two young alien soldiers against the side of the corridor. The gravity in the hallway was low, but the crate had immense mass. It was heavy and solid. The soldiers screamed in pain as the heavy box pressed against their fragile chests, threatening to crush their ribs. Dozens of alien crew members rushed to help. They grabbed the edges of the crate and pulled with all their might. They strained their thin arms, but the crate did not move a single inch. It was too heavy. They were a species evolved for floating, not for lifting. Panic filled the air. They shouted for a hydraulic lifter machine, but the nearest one was on the other side of the ship. The trapped soldiers stopped screaming and started gasping for air. Time was running out. Zill watched in horror, realizing that his crew was going to die because they were too weak to move the obstacle. Then, the floor shook. Sergeant Mike appeared around the corner. He was still wearing his gym clothes and holding a protein shake. He saw the chaos and dropped his drink. He did not run frantically, he moved with heavy, deliberate steps. He walked straight to the crate. The other aliens shouted at him to stop, warning him that the weight would break his spine. Mike ignored them. He looked at the crate and assessed the weight. It was heavy, but on this low-gravity station, it was lighter than his warm-up weights on Earth. Mike placed his hands under the bottom edge of the crate. He spread his feet apart and planted his boots firmly on the metal floor. Zill froze. He recognized the movement immediately. It was the exact same motion Mike had practiced in the death chamber. Mike lowered his hips, kept his back straight, and took a deep breath. "Clear out," he grunted. He drove his heels into the floor and pulled. His muscles swelled, and the veins in his neck stood out. With a loud screech of metal against metal, the massive crate began to rise. The aliens gasped in disbelief. Mike lifted the crushing weight until it was off the soldiers. He held it there, his face calm and focused, acting as a human pillar of strength. "Pull them out. Now," he yelled. The crew quickly dragged their injured friends to safety. Mike waited until they were clear, then he controlled the weight and lowered it gently back to the floor. He stood up, dusted off his hands, and picked up his drink. Zill looked at the human with awe. He finally understood. The terrifying gravity of Earth did not just crush bones, it forged living weapons. The humans were not crazy, they were simply preparing to carry the weight that no one else could.